We're going to talk about how to do factoring by grouping. And exercise 1A and B kind of starts us with the idea of rearranging using the commutative property. And in the case of A and B, they're asking us to factor a binomial common factor out of each. So you'll see that each of these have a 2x plus 1, which means when we rewrite this, we're going to have two sets of binomials. We'll have x plus 7 and 2x plus 1. Those are our two binomial factors. And same thing with B, you'll see that they have the x minus 2's in common. So you can rewrite this using the commutative property as 5x minus 4 with that common factor of x minus 2. And again, the idea is just the distributive property being used twice, and that's what we do with FOIL. We distribute for both terms to both other terms in parentheses. Now we're going to move on to exercise 3, talk about some of the properties that we've discussed in Unit 1 before. And they want us to use, for this question, commutative, associative, or distributive. And they want us to justify each step with one of those three properties. So what you'll notice with the first step is that parentheses have been added, but no term has actually moved. So in the case of the first step, this is going to be associative, because you are taking terms and grouping them together. Now with the second one, we find that we have common factors being divided out. So this would be your distributive property. And we're distributing by division. And then for the last step, it's commutative because we are taking terms and from above to here, we are rearranging them. So when we do our factoring by grouping, we're actually going to use all three of our major properties when we're talking about number sense. Now let's get into an example. In the first example we're going to look at, exercise number 4, they want us to use that factoring by grouping. What we're trying to do is break these into two separate sets of 2 that we can factor out a term out of each one. Hopefully leave us with the common factor at the end. So if I take these first 2, and I group these 2 together, I notice that I have an x squared that I can divide out of each. So when I divide that x squared out, I'm going to have 3x plus 2. Now I'll know if I did it right, because when I do the next part, I'm hoping to have the same factor in the parentheses left over. So it looks like in this case, I can divide out a negative 9, and then what I have left would be 3x and positive 2. So now I can rearrange those terms, and rearranging these I get x squared minus 9 and 3x plus 2. And then I notice that x squared minus 9 is one of those difference of perfect squares we talked about. So I can actually factor this as again into x plus 3 and x minus 3. And then I have the 3x plus 2 as well from earlier. So my completely factored expression would be this. Now, kind of moving on from there, let's take a look at one more. We're going to look at B. And in the case of this first 2 terms, it looks like we could take out a 9 and an x squared. And then in the parentheses, we're going to have 2x plus 1. Now, looking at the second 2 terms, it looks like I can take out only a negative 1. And that's going to leave me with that 2x plus 1 that we had in the first common factor. So if I rearrange this, I got 9x squared minus 1, and then 2x plus 1. But again, I have a difference of perfect squares here, which this would be 3x minus 1 and 3x plus 1. And then we have the 2x plus 1. So that would be our completely factored form for this question. Now, not all the time are you going to have a difference of perfect squares for these, so it's something to look out for. If you look at one other one like D, I can take out for D, I can do a 5x squared. for these first two terms, and then I'm left with x plus 2. And then similar, the last two terms, it looks like I can take out a 20. And then I have x plus 2. So what I have right now is I have a 5x squared plus 20, and then x plus 2 in the second parentheses. And I'm looking at the 5x squared and 20, and I'm like, oh, I can factor out a 5. So that means I have a 5 in front, x squared plus 4, and x plus 2, and that would be my completely factored form. So we're going to use a lot of the techniques we already talked about in the first 4 lessons for factoring. So why don't you try C, and then let me come check it and see what you get done. And then similar on the next page, just talking about which questions you have to complete.